Introduction. The first thing to understand about Marx's philosophy is that it is driven by outcome rather than inquiry. Marx only discusses certain things in a constrained way in order to reach the conclusions he wishes to reach. A glance at Marxist historicism, especially with reference to the Communist Manifesto, presents this case very well. Marx's over-reliance on the dialectic is always his main fault. Unable to eschew from this view, he rigorously boils down all facets of history and economics to the simplest of ideas, namely that as a result of two things coming together, a third will arise and remove the other two as important. However, when picking and choosing what has happened and why it has happened, this is always with the end goal of the inevitability of communism. One should always be wary of those who preach inevitability, especially someone without all the facts necessary, and has a particular worldview and uses a defunct part of a social science that is not in use academically anymore. Therefore, I believe that by looking at the foundations of Das Kapital, namely its short first chapter, it is possible for anyone to dismantle the whole concept of Marxist economics. So let's begin. What is Marx trying to prove? Marx is setting out to prove that nothing in economics is more important than labour. A commodity's exchange rate and use value, a topic we will discuss in detail, are unimportant when calculating something's true value. Also, that commodities have a singular true value. This was a common historical idea in political economy, going right back to the ancient Greeks. The two ideas are intrinsically linked in order to explain the variations in how something is valued from its initial existence to the exchange value. The idea is that a commodity, always a proper, tangible thing, can be expressed in three different ways. A use value, for example, the eating of corn. An exchange value, the amount of something else that will be needed to exchange for that commodity. And a true value. This is the actual objective value of a commodity that Marx believes can only be expressed through labour. In addition to all of this is how Marx views labour. For Marx, all labour is homogeneous, whether one is lazy or a zealot. Units of labour apply themselves to the social unit as a whole and on average create the most that is needed by society. The mechanism through which they do this is historical in nature. In Rome there were the patricians and plebeians, then the lords and serfs, and finally the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It is from this bedrock of ideas that Marx then proposes the ideas of wage theft and surplus value. These then become the basis of how the economy will one day progress from capitalism to communism. How does he prove that this is the case? Marx uses mainly philosophical arguments to prove his initial points, as, although later he does tend to use raw data, usually of dubious quality, but that certainly suits his needs, here he relies on argumentation to carry his points across. Firstly, we will need to look at the world-building aspect of this creation. Marx believed that capitalism can be best described as an immense accumulation of commodities. That these commodities are, in the first place, an object outside of us, a thing that, by its properties, satisfies human wants of some sort or another. This is part of Marx making the analysis of a commodity. Das Kapital initially ignores two parts of a commodity: the nature of the wants driving the demand for the commodity and the type of wants that commodity satisfies, whether it's to form the end-user consumption or it is part of the production cycle. All commodities are homogeneous. He then goes on to state that useful things can be boiled down by two essential properties: quantity and quality. These are the only two ways of viewing any commodity. The measurements of these commodities is historical and made up of convention and diversity in the products. The utility of the thing makes it a use value, is the next statement that gives us another rule to the world Marx is creating for us. By this sentence, Marx means that the utility of a commodity, the usefulness that the consumer gains from the consumption, imbues a commodity with a use value. This use value is not a thing of the air, but rather is absolutely tied to the commodity in question. The use value can therefore be measured in dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. Use value is only ever brought into reality by consumption. These are the forms of all wealth and the basis for all exchange values. Marx, however, is uninterested in exchange value for the most part. He considers it irrelevant, as if you can express the value of one commodity to another, it stands to reason that you can quantify all commodities together in this way. All commodities can be exchanged for each other, and therefore there must be a third, hidden element between each of the exchanges that is actually determining the value. As Marx concludes, as use values, commodities are above all of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. Marx then retires the consideration of use values and focuses on labour. All commodities are the products of labour. This labour is a unit, a generic classification. Essentially, labour units applied to things with use value gives you commodities. These labour units are homogeneous, and regardless of the fitness, skill, intellect, or any other factor, these units are the same as any other, so far it has the character of the average labour power of society, and takes effects as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on average, and no more than is socially necessary. This then leads Marx to discuss his conclusion on absolute value, which he will from now on refer to solely as value. This is the social value intrinsic in any commodity, as commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities of labour are embodied, or which can be produced at the same time, have the same value. There is an absolute homogeneity between the products of labour and labour itself. Marx continues that the expenditure of labour is the means by which higher and lower rates of value are created. For example, in favourable weather, one labour unit might give you 8 bushels of corn, whereas in unfavourable conditions, it will only give you 4 bushels. Therefore, the amount of labour needed to produce 4 bushels is twice that of 8 bushels. This is why it has a higher value. Marx then summarises use value and value. A thing can be a use value without having value. For example, naturally occurring quality soil or clean air. These factors contain use value, but as no labour has been applied, they do not contain a value. However, even the application of labour does not create a commodity. A commodity can only be created when someone has applied labour to something, and then the product must be transferred to another, whom it will serve as a use value by means of exchange. The chapter then ends with the line, "Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labour contained in it. The labour does not count as labour and therefore creates no value." Why are his arguments incorrect? Marx's carefully built world is neatly wrapped up by his persuasive explanations. However, my advice, always when arguing on these matters, is not to take the world as presented to you as a fact. The structure of the Marxian world is not as airtight as the Marxists would like you to believe. So when you consider the arguments presented to you by the left, take your time to understand why they are making these arguments, rather than what they are trying to argue about. As an analogy, think of a flat earther presenting you with a proof against gravity. The argument seems very legitimate and convincing. It has a healthy sprinkling of science and data behind it. However, when you step back from that singular argument, you can see that the world in which this argument lives is shaky and unscientific. I will look at Marx's arguments as they are presented to us in order. Is capitalism an immense accumulation of commodities? It is certainly a function or as a result of capitalism, but not the initial starting point of capitalism. The accumulation doesn't have to be immense for capitalism to exist, nor does this fall solely under the heading of goods. Capitalism is the free exchange of goods and services without intervention from an external force. All capitalism requires is, as the famous phrase goes, "I have some apples here. Would you like to buy one?" Ignoring the services aspect of capitalism, as well as being an easy way to focus primarily on physical commodities, which makes the labour theory of value slat into reality a lot easier, also removes the central aspect of exchange as the most necessary component of capitalism. For one to say it is merely an immense accumulation of commodities means that any hoarder who collects old newspapers or a Stone Age kitchen midden filled with seashells is by nature a capitalistic process. But without the means of exchange, it simply makes capitalism the dragon sitting on the pile of gold from a fantasy novel. Noting that Marx was a communist before he was an economist makes the necessity of this connection obvious. Capitalism cannot operate in such a simple vacuum. You need to have society to perpetuate it. Two or more people must engage in an exchange of goods or services under a written or implied contract. Then what is a commodity? In short, a commodity can be something inside of us. A thought or an idea is commodifiable. Some people make profits by this alone. A commodity is just something that someone else is willing to make an exchange for or wants as their own. Callously, and in an absolute sense, this does include things like love, friendship, and sexual favours. The process of commodification is key here. Whether someone is willing to commodify a part of their life, be that a service or a good they have produced, is up to them. Quantity and quality. Marx again here limits his scope to two, seemingly, broad areas of inquiry. However, quantity and quality are not the only factors to look at when considering the properties of a useful thing. Accessibility is probably the main factor in any good, and although one could see this trait as a function of quantity, this is not always the case. For example, there are hundreds of millions of ounces of gold in Fort Knox. However, although the quality of the gold is of the highest standard and there is a vast quantity, it is not accessible, and therefore people do not assign a value to it in their day-to-day lives. In an absolute sense, gold has value, but the accessibility of this particular gold holds no value to the common man as he cannot access it. Use value, utility, and commodities. When we look at our explanation of what a commodity actually is, rather than Marx's own narrow view, the paragraph starting, "The utility of a thing makes it a use value," does not make any sense. Utility is most definitely a thing of the air. The physical constraints of an object do not imbue it with utility. A thing need not have any physical characteristic in order to make it useful. This is only measurable relatively compared to the other things that a person wants or needs. The useful property of a commodity exists regardless of the labour or even existence of the commodity. This usefulness or utility is aside from the thing itself. It exists only in the mind of someone who wants it. It is not intrinsic to that thing, for even without the thing, the desire would still be there. For example, a man sick with a disease with no known cure would surely give his little all for a remedy to this ailment. But as such a thing does not exist, it cannot have any physical properties. This is until a snake oil salesman with some perfumed water convinces the man that this is a remedy to his disease. But the man, as many poor souls have and will do, will sell all his worldly goods for more and more of this commodity, convinced of its usefulness. Again, the foundations of these false arguments lead Marx to erroneous conclusions, such as use values become a reality only by use or consumption. This is entirely untrue, as we have explained before. The use value of a commodity is an additional flavour to a commodity Marx has added as part of his world building. Things are not useful in and of themselves, only as a function of the wants of people. The use value, as described here, can become a reality without it even existing. This principle for use value becomes highly important when dealing with Marx's later claim on how pay and profits work. Exchange value. The fallacy in Marx's thinking here is that there is a parity between exchange values. Marx is determined to add this logic into his argument because so much of what he wants to talk about later relies on it. There is no inference to be made here. It leads us to one of the major failings of Marx's analysis: time. When you add time into any economic argument, it becomes magnitudes of times more complicated, but also more real. Marx has given us a snapshot of a market in which, for one perfect moment, there is an exchange value for each thing that can be replaced with the exchange value of another, and that this would be acceptable. However, not only has this marketplace never existed, it regulates the wants of the consumer to nothing. Marx's marketplace implies two things. All goods must be consumed, and the relative exchange value from one good to another must be accepted as the relative position between a third. Both of these statements are of course false. Nothing needs to be consumed. Not all things created and sold are useful. Not everything is wanted or needed. Marx's marketplace contains no actual people, just consumer bots who do the bidding of their creator. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever proportions they may be, can be represented by the equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. Example, 1/4 corn equals X hundredweight of iron. This line further illustrates the fallacious thinking. Just because an item is exchangeable, this does not mean it has an exchange rate. The rate only happens after the two sides who own, or at least lay claim to the ownership of that commodity, agree to this exchange. It is wholly outside of anything else. It is singular and transactional. To then infer the following. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, 1/4 of corn and X hundredweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. There is absolutely no evidence for this statement. The third thing they should be reduced to here are the myriad of factors that go into the production process, the wants of the buyer, and the preference ordering of both parties. The act of buying and selling is psychological and not a sociological process. Each transaction operates in its own terms, as it relies on two people at different points in time with ever-shifting wants and needs making decisions. It is not a homogeneous expression of labour units being exchanged, as Marx's idea of what a labour unit is remains an internal contradiction. The retiring of use value and considering labour value. I believe it is here that Marx truly diverts from reality. Having convinced himself, and unfortunately millions of others, that these fallacies, he has then decided on a course that will lead to further and further erroneous claims. The retiring of use value seems to come from nowhere, as he states. If we then leave out of the consideration the use value of commodities, why? There seems to be no reason for the true value not to contain use value. This arbitrary separation of value, use value, and utility eventually culminates in the sentence, a thing can be a use value without having value, which even in Marx's world it cannot. Anything can have a value overall to society. It can be exchanged and given away without an iota of labour applied to it. Because of this first consideration of what value is, Marx is then able to garden path the reader to conclusions he wants to get at in the first place, namely that all value is created by labour. Marx's example here is actually one of supply and demand. For example, the same amount of labour in favourable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, and unfavourably only in 4, as if this would have any bearing at the price at market. If the farmer could not find a buyer at the inflated price, due to demand remaining constant while supply fell, he would need to sell at the normal rate. It is likely he will receive an increased price, but this has nothing to do with the labour unit applied per bushel ratio. It is just a function of how much money was available in the market to spend on corn and the appetite for the commodity at that time. Marx summarises his argument neatly in the line, in general, the greater the productiveness of labour, the less is the labour time required for the production cycle, and the less amount of labour crystallised in the article, and the less its value. With real-world examples, this does not hold true, even in a general sense. Imagine a pizza parlour. You go in and order a pizza. It takes 15 minutes and you happily pay. However, if the same pizza took an hour, you would probably not pay or at least ask for a discount. A car manufacturer making luxury vehicles has a new process installed to reduce the time needed for employees to work on the cars. Does the price go down? No. The seller will continue to ask for the highest price possible and not begin flogging Ferraris as family cars. An author signs a copy of her novel. This is a very low productive amount of labour that takes a very short amount of time. However, the book's value has now skyrocketed. But if she applies the same labour to a cow or use prophylactic equipment, then the price for these goods will not rise in the same extent. All labour is not interchangeable, and averaging it out over society does not make any sense. Summary of use value and value. A thing can be a use value without having value. Marx considers naturally occurring factors of production as irrelevant, as a person must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. So Marx believes that a commodity no one else wants contains no value, and that, if a thing is useless, so is the labour contained in it. The labour does not count as labour, and therefore creates no value. The problem is, again, time. Marx's marketplace is a social snapshot of society at a singular place in time. All modes of the production process are taken as happening almost simultaneously. For example, you spend a couple of months applying labour to land and capital, transforming a field in which nothing was growing before into a lush field of golden corn. You spend a week or so harvesting the corn and then carefully storing it. Up until this point, everything is working as it should. The factors of production are easily separated. The labour applied can be easily seen as transformative. You have taken a fallow field and created a corn crop. So then you start selling it and no one wants to buy. All of a sudden, your labour now does not count as labour, according to Marx. Up until the point of exchange, labour teeters between having value and not having value. If this is the case, then labour cannot be the determining factor in what gives something value. If labour value has no true value until an exchange value is determined, then labour value is subservient to exchange value. Marx here contradicts himself in a major way. This can also be applied in a positive way to factory workers, for example. The factory worker applies their labour under contract. They create a product, and regardless of it being bought or sold, they will still be compensated for this productive process. This is due to time and risk. Most people do not have time to create and sell products themselves. Therefore, in order to offset this real problem, they sign a contract to produce goods in someone else's manufactory and receive a wage. This takes care of time. If they create a product which does not sell, it is no skin off their nose, as they are contracted to make what they are asked, and assuming they are making the product to the best of their ability, then they negate the risk involved in entrepreneurship while reaping the rewards of work. Up until the point of exchange, the value of something we own is completely of the air. You may look at something with deeply sentimental value, that you might pay a king's ransom to have returned to you, but in the marketplace would that have value to anyone else? Then its use value is subjective, and its social value is high only to you. Even the intrinsic physical nature of something can be interpreted differently by people, and it's this interpretation that gives it any value. Conclusion. Marx saw the world as more complicated in its simplest expressions and simpler in some of its more complicated aspects. For example, utility, value, use value, and exchange value are really just expressions of one thing: exchange price. You cannot know the value of something until you exchange it or are offered an exchange for it. Even the mental process of weighing up this price in your mind can vary in the reality of the situation. The act of being in the marketplace with money or with something to sell is where the following happens. We find out if the utility of the good is something we truly want or need. The physical properties of that thing, if any exist, when purchased, become useful to us. Any labour that was contained in the process of creating the commodity receives a true value which can be fed back to the production process. An exchange rate is set for the good at that time, and which, if needed, can serve as a benchmark for others. Every part of Marx's treatise of value only comes to fruition when an exchange price is set and an exchange is made, which is why viewing them as objective, finite, and measurable before the fact leads us to such dangerous places. What consequences do the incorrect assumptions have when applied to the real world? The most obvious real-world example of how these ideas clash with the reality of the production process has obviously got to be the disastrous Soviet economy. The Soviet economy was absolutely based on the principles outlined in Das Kapital. Marxist-Leninism is still the road down which most communists will find themselves going economically even to this day. The most major problem arises in Marx's ignorance of price indicators in the capital market. When we go right back to the start of this chapter, we find the line, "Neither are we concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as a means of subsistence or indirectly as a means of production." Without understanding the importance of capital market in terms of how that influences the economy as a whole, and instead of perceiving all exchanges and values as part of a homogeneous expression of labor value, the Soviet economy was doomed to fail. As von Mises says, "The fundamental objection advanced against the predictability of socialism refers to the impossibility of economic calculation. It has been demonstrated in an irrefutable way that a socialist commonwealth would not be in a position to apply economic calculation. Where there are no market prices for the factors of production because they are neither bought nor sold, it is impossible to resort to calculation in planning future action and in determining the results of past action. A socialist management of production would simply not know whether or not what it plans to execute is the most appropriate means to attain the end sought. It will operate in the dark, as it were. It will squander the scarce factors of production, both material and human. Chaos and poverty for all will unavoidably result." I could make a whole video on the additional failures and how the thinking of Marx compounded the terrible decisions of command economies in every aspect of life. A tragic example of this can be found in an article from the Mises Institute. Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet scientist who was determined to prove that his own pseudoscientific theories on botany were fact. Lysenko's actions and practices contributed to the famine that killed millions of Soviet people. Eventually, his practices had to be outlawed. They were so dangerous and destructive. Although evident from the start, Lysenko's inefficiencies were allowed to continue due to a combination of party loyalty, fear, and idealism. The Soviet leadership liked Lysenko's ideas, so he was able to keep on with his terrible plans for a long time. A profit motive or price indicator, or even a robust scouring of the data and its results, could have halted this in its tracks, saving millions of lives and allowing people to adopt actual scientifically proven policies. When an individual or a group is allowed to exist outside of the profit-making and price indicator spectrum, then either many costly reviews of their finding will be needed, or gross inefficiencies will be made. This is one of the benefits of the invisible hand, and thus why the capitalistic mode of production serves us so well. Economically, Marx was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and this makes his idea of how the economy works dangerous. The only way of combating this danger is through education and vigilance. Share this video where it is needed and use the arguments here and anywhere else you can. Stay educated and continue to read economists with something to offer, like Mrs. Hayek and Rothbard. Thank you very much for watching.